Early in your book, and I wrote it down, you write this: viruses were here long before us. You go on to say that they exist on the edge of life and they challenge our definitions of what it means to be a living thing. It's a box of chemicals, as you say. So when you describe it that way, it really is fascinating for everybody, isn't it?
So if you were to stop and pause for a minute and say, what makes something alive, right? We know that a stone is not alive. We know that human beings and birds and fish and reptiles and trees and plants are alive. When do you go from living to non-living? And it's a very hard thing to figure out. And there are some classic definitions, you know, living things reproduce and they need energy and they produce metabolic waste and so on. But whatever definition you use of a living thing, flu doesn't really fit those. It really is an inert box of chemicals that has somehow evolved with the one goal in mind to reproduce as quickly as it can, which is obviously the driving force of all evolution, but it's inert. It does nothing without a cell that it can get into, that it can invade. So it's like a box of chemicals sitting in a bottle, waiting for an opportunity to wreak its havoc.
It's interesting reading your book. You liken it sort of to like a Xerox machine, a copying machine, and you talk about viruses and the similarities and dissimilarities between influenza and perhaps Ebola and HIV. So kind of break that down for us.
Sure. So viruses like HIV and Ebola and the common cold are these packets of chemicals that reproduce. Flu is very special in that it needs the machinery of the cell in a special way to reproduce. It gets into the cell, and only once it's in the cell can it hijack the material of our cells and reproduce. And as it reproduces, it shuffles its genes, and so it changes a little bit, which is why we have different flu strains. And sometimes it can, a flu strain that is primarily found in humans can mix with a flu strain that is primarily found in birds, and we can end up with an entirely novel or new kind of flu. And that makes it out there, and then we start getting into all kinds of trouble because now our bodies are going to have to fight an infection, and they don't recognize this influenza. So like HIV, the influenza virus is very good at changing its shape, its outer cover, which makes it very hard for the body to recognize, and also very hard for us to produce a vaccine against something when the surface is changing so often and we can't make a vaccine against that surface.
Flu viruses can evolve in a gradual way through mutations. Someone previously protected against one strain is not always able to fight the mutated virus, which means they then become sick. So the changing of the raincoat, that mutating, that's the scary piece of it, isn't it?
That's right. And it makes the flu vaccine business very, very challenging. So what scientists always try and do is they take a bit of the flu virus that the body will recognize, and they inject those few proteins into the body mounts a response against the vaccine, and then it's ready when the real flu strikes. The problem is that those proteins can change, and as you said, it's a bit like this overcoat. You've taught the body to recognize a brown overcoat, but now the person is wearing a black overcoat, and the body doesn't recognize that as an intruder. What scientists are trying to do is to manufacture a vaccine against a part of the flu virus that remains constant. That would give us what's called a universal flu vaccine. So although the overcoat changes a lot, there may be parts of the flu vaccine that are conserved from year to year and from strain to strain. And if we can make a vaccine against those conserved parts of the virus bits that stay the same year to year and strain to strain, then we'll only need to give the flu vaccine maybe once in a lifetime as opposed to every year, and against all strains as opposed to different strains. That sounds very easy to do, but it is taking scientists a lot of time and effort to come up with this. And the truth is that even as we speak, that is still an elusive goal, that universal flu vaccine.
Year to year, strain to strain, and for a guy who's on the front lines, emergency room physician, as you have been, describe that for us, because I guess it's preparing for a soccer season, and suddenly the team changes each year. So what's it like being there on the front lines in the ER and seeing year to year, strain to strain?
Yeah, Well, we're pretty ready for the onslaughts. Flu season begins, in the late fall and goes through to the early spring. We're ready for it. We understand it. All of us as healthcare providers get the flu vaccine ourselves because, as I say, even though it's not terribly effective, it does some good. And one of the things I often hear from patients is, well, how could I get the flu? I've been vaccinated. Right. Sometimes they blame the vaccine. It is not the vaccine, but sometimes they say, well, I'm not going to get vaccinated again because look what it did this time. The vaccine doesn't give you the flu. But it's because we don't have this perfect match between what is in the vaccine and the actual flu that's circulating out there that we have this mismatch, and patients can be vaccinated and still turn up in the ER. The ER can be really overrun with patients with the flu. The typical site might be 7 or 8 or 9 patients sitting in the waiting room with their coats over their shoulders and a mask so they don't cough the virus out. These are the people who feel well enough to sit. Obviously, if you're sicker than that, you're brought right back into the ED where we will examine you, take a story, a history, do blood tests as appropriate. Some patients will need a chest x-ray to make sure that they hadn't got any evidence of a pneumonia, a bacterial pneumonia. But for the vast majority of patients, the treatment for the flu is symptomatic, meaning we can diagnose it clinically. We don't necessarily need to have a flu test. And we can reassure the patient that with time and fluids and bed rest and something for the fever, they will get better. The challenge is always finding those few patients every shift or few patients every week who you actually do need to bring into the hospital. And those are typically the patients who are either very young or very old, patients who have immune systems that don't work properly. And those are at much higher risk of complications from the flu. And when we see those patients, if they are already at higher risk or do have a complication of the flu, we'll have to admit them either to the regular hospital or to the intensive care unit. But that's only a small number of the patients that we see.
Epidemic versus pandemic. A lot of people get those confused. Break it down for us.
Well, these terms vary depending on who uses them. An epidemic is usually thought of to be something that is more local, a local infectious disease that is in higher numbers than previously. And a pandemic is something that perhaps crosses borders. We have to be very careful how we use these terms. And I think that we've all learned from this. So we've had outbreaks of flu which have been called pandemics or epidemics. And governments, sometimes actually government organizations have used those terms when all the organization really means is it's at a higher rate than usual. And so it qualifies as an epidemic. But that doesn't mean that it's more deadly than usual. And sometimes this is miscommunicated, and the government officials in previous flu outbreaks have described something as a pandemic. It has been interpreted as being more deadly than usual, which was not what the case was. It was just meant it's available, it's out there in higher numbers. So a pandemic is really this outbreak of an infectious disease that crosses borders and in much higher numbers than we've usually seen. But when you hear the words epidemic and pandemic used in a report on the media, you have to be very careful and to make sure that you understand exactly the context in which the word is being used.
In an effort to better prepare for pandemics, scientists have modified bird flu viruses, but in ways that could actually make them more risky to humans. Lab studies have proven controversial, with some wondering if the benefits outweigh the risks.
One of the things that people talk about, though, is tinkering with viruses and creating super viruses and that sort of thing. How big a concern is that?
Well, it was a very big concern for the government, who in or around 2014 actually banned certain types of research that involve changing the virus. The scientific community, of course, was upset with that, right. I think. I mean, they feel that we need to do this research. And about a year ago, actually, some new guidelines were put in place that allow certain types of studying in which you're actually tinkering with the flu virus. But the truth of the matter is, unless we actually tinker with the virus in those ways, we will never really know what this virus could potentially mutate into. So those studies are very, very important, but they do need to be monitored in some way.
So it's handcuffing the scientific community in a sense, I guess. But you have to have those rules and guidelines. I suppose you have to think about both sides, right?
Well, the concern is, some mad scientist is going to be playing with the virus and it accidentally gets released, and now we're facing a flu virus, the likes of which have never been seen before. Of course, we know that that's extremely unlikely. That doesn't work like that. But there are concerns, and I think what the scientific community must do is explain itself. Right? We need to be able to have a public face that explains why these kinds of studies are so important, not only for the patients, but also for public health in general.
In the past century, there have been 4 pandemics. The one in 1918 was the worst. More than 100 years later, the threat of a flu pandemic remains. It has the ability to emerge anywhere and spread rapidly across the globe.
1918 would be a pandemic. What would create the perfect storm for a pandemic 100 years later?
Yeah. The question that followed 1918 is, could this happen again today? Could something like this occur? And there are the pessimists and the optimists. The pessimists say, of course, something like this could happen again. In fact, it's only a matter of time. And the pessimists say, look, the reason it hasn't happened yet, the reason that there was no epidemic last year or the year before, was that we dodged a bullet. They look at the fact that we don't have great anti-flu medications, as we've discussed. They look at the fact that we now have an interconnected world in which you can get on a plane and be on the other side of the world literally in 12 hours. And you will spend that time coughing out your flu onto people on the plane. And they look at the fact that we live in this very connected society in which the flu virus can travel very easily. And they look back and say, okay, it's a matter of time till we get this epidemic or pandemic for a second time. The optimists look at the same data and say, well, wait a minute. It's been 100 years since the Great Flu Epidemic. Yes, there have been bad outbreaks, but nothing anywhere near the scale that we've had in the past. We now understand the flu virus in a much more complete way than we ever did before. We now understand how it is transmitted so we can prevent that transmission. And perhaps most importantly, we now have antibiotics against those secondary infections. We mentioned earlier that it is thought that perhaps most people died in 1918 not from the flu itself, but from the secondary bacterial infections, and that today we have very good antibiotics so long as we continue to use them appropriately and not mismanage them. We have good antibiotics, and so the optimists say, look, we're probably not going to have another epidemic like this because we have in place the systems that we need. We understand how these things work. We have antibiotics in place. We have intensive care units to take care of our sickest patients. That they didn't have back in 1918, and so it's not going to happen. The only thing you can be sure of is that neither side knows for 100% whether they're correct.
While the science behind the flu has come a long way in the past 100 years, there is still no universal flu vaccine, no magic bullet effective against all strains.
Modern medicine, we've seen so many advances, and we see all these news stories about these great new advances. And yet this, as I said earlier, is so tricky. It's eluded all of those advances in many respects. And you're even talking about getting the flu shot. I mean, that's a crapshoot. Why do you think that is?
Well, we like to think that we've figured things out, right? We like to think that we're in control of our society, we're in control of our surroundings. We're scientific, we have answers. And if we don't have answers, we know how to get to those answers. If we acknowledge what we don't know and we figure a pathway to get there. The problem is that even with figuring out the pathways to get there, we're still up against some very hard facts of nature. So we've discussed how the flu virus changes its outer shell very, very often and making it very hard to produce a vaccine. That's a fact of nature, and we can think about that and understand it and really get to we can describe it with beautiful color pictures, but that doesn't enable us to get to fix it, doesn't enable us to get to the cure. So I think that we are in this position where we think with our scientific methodology, we surely must have answers to these things. To put it in perspective, we were promised a vaccine to HIV in the 1980s. We were told it was just a matter of 2 or 3 years till a vaccine is available for HIV back in the 1980s. And here we are 40 years later, and we have no vaccine in sight. So we have an understanding of what's out there. We have DNA and RNA, and we can understand the very makeup of the flu virus or the HIV virus. We know how it reproduces. We know what it looks like under an electron microscope. But it's still challenging for so many of these reasons to actually get on top of the disease. And we've had some remarkable successes, right? So smallpox has been eradicated. Polio has been eradicated in most Western countries, and it is really a disease that we can vaccinate against. We no longer see children dying from mumps and measles. Rubella has gone away. And these are all great victories of modern medicine. And so why is it that we can't do the same for influenza? People scratch their heads and say, and it's frustrating, but it's a reality. And the good news is that good minds are trying to figure this out. But we should really temper, I think, our expectations of how quickly we'll be able to conquer this particular virus. As I've said, we have great minds working on this, and quite significant government resources across the world are being put into influenza research. But that quest for the universal influenza vaccine that will be good as a one-shot, and we'll have it, and will be good against influenza for the rest of our lives, that is still something that is very, very far away. And as we mentioned, there are not good medications to fight the flu virus itself. So I think we're some ways away from being able to declare victory on influenza.
Thank you so much. It's been a delight.
You're very welcome. Thank you.